We've moved from the church to the Garden of Eden. Now, I want to comment on the Israel Folau kerfuffle, because it raised a lot of questions regarding freedom of speech and constitutional protections. But before I do that, I'd like to explain a few things. Now, Mr. Folau did a post that it's difficult to describe. What he basically did is he looked at the Old Testament, because he's a Christian fundamentalist. He picked out a group of people in that Old Testament who were going to go to hell if they didn't repent. And people like me were on that list. Atheists, homosexual, atheists, adulterers, liars. So it's just basically what he's done is removed some material from the Old Testament, which is a legal document, and put a post on. But he had a contract with Rugby Union Australia, Australian Rugby Union Federation. He had a contract with them. And that contract meant that he had to follow a particular code of conduct. And the dispute is about whether he followed that code of conduct. And he's been found guilty by a 3-person appointed commission of a high-end breach of that code of conduct. Now, there'd be many Australians who would have no problem with what Mr. Folau said, because what he was basically doing was picking out things from the Old Testament, and he put them in his Facebook page. Now, I'm an atheist. I'm a post-religious atheist. I did have a religious phase till I was 16, and then I realised, it's like reading the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales. So I've been an atheist since I was about 16. Now, I have no problem with being called a sinner by Mr. Israel Folau or any religious fundamentalist of any denomination, because we need to remember that the Old Testament is the book which is recognised and respected and worshipped by Jews, Christians and Muslims. So we need to recognise that. And if you go to court, you can either swear in the Quran or the Bible, or you can the Torah, or you can actually swear you're going to affirm. So it's a fundamental part of our structure here in Australia, our constitutional structure. Now, as I said before, the Australian Constitution doesn't give you many protections, but it does give you a protection regarding religious belief. Every Australian has a protection, a constitutional protection regarding religious belief. And my concern is that when we sign codes of conduct with employers or organisations that we wish to be members of, whether those organisations can actually suspend our constitutional rights as individuals, because the Constitution is there not only to regulate the relationship between the states and the federal parliament, but also there to protect, to a lesser degree, the individual. And although the Australian Constitution has minimal constitutional protections for the individual, it does have the constitutional protection of religious belief and also the constitutional implied right to free speech. So these are the two things. So I could sign a contract with you that I would be your slave for the next 12 months. Don't get your hopes up, it's not going to happen. But I could sign that contract with you, right? Now, if I want to get out of that contract and you want to hold me to that contract, no court of law would enforce that contract, because that contract I signed was actually illegal in the first place. Now, many of us today are forced to sign contracts, confidentiality agreements, contracts with employers. There was a recent High Court case which went to the High Court 2 weeks ago regarding a federal bureaucrat who was fired from a job because she was running a private Twitter stream which was criticising the Department of Immigration and Homeland Security while she was an employee of that, but she was doing it anonymously. Because of a federal police investigation, they found out who it was. So the High Court actually hasn't handed down a judgment on that. So this is very important. I mean, I think Israel is a silly man. I don't think he's a malicious man or a bad man. I just think he's a silly man. But he has raised some important ideas that we need to look at very seriously. Because if we don't look at these ideas very seriously and fight against this avalanche of pressure to conform to certain social stereotypes and social norms, we will soon find that most of us will lose any constitutional protections we have. And that's the dilemma. Can an organisation force you as an individual to actually sign a piece of paper and enforce that piece of paper if it overrides your constitutional protections or if it is illegal? For example, if I agreed to work for you for $5 an hour, which is about $13 below the basic wage or the minimum wage, that's illegal. And no court would enforce that contract. The court would say that I have been diddled and I should be paid back pay if I protested. So it's not a binding contract. So these code of conduct contracts that have now part and parcel of sporting bodies, organisations we belong to, employment contracts, federal government employment contracts, state government employment contracts, local government employment contracts. Are they constitutionally valid? Can they remove our implied right to free speech? For example, the Victorian State Government passed legislation last year which bans elected councillors from speaking to the media unless they speak through the mayor. So the question is, there are people who may have views we disagree with, but does a company or a government agency have the right to force you to sign a contract that actually talks about behaviour which is not illegal in the contract? Can you constitutionally give up your rights to free speech or implied free speech? So it's an important issue because more and more we've been asked to sign contracts, whether it's for to buy a phone or a contract to a bit of casual employment or a full-time contract for full-time employment. And as we know that in the Catholic schools and in the religious-based schools in this country, they get their teachers to sign contracts that not only prevent them from speaking, but more importantly, prevent them from being involved in different types of relationships. That is a prerequisite to employment in that particular area. And as we know, religious organisations have a dispensation as far as the Racial Discrimination Act is concerned and as far as other discrimination acts are concerned. But that's not my issue. My issue is this, what we're seeing currently, is this push to regulate behaviour which is neither illegal or hateful, and how a lot of behaviour which is a difference of opinion has been categorised as being hateful. And the dilemma is that at this particular point in time the shoe is on our foot, but it may be in 5 years' time the shoe will be on their foot. And the same type of laws and the same type of contracts can be used to deny us our ability to freely articulate our ideas. In 1932, legislation was passed through the federal parliament which made it illegal for anybody to advocate the abolishment of government, the abolishment of the state. And that was a reaction to what was happening in Spain in 1936, where the anarchist movement was quite powerful and they were talking about abolishing the state and replacing it with a federation of community and workplace councils. So the concept of being freely able to articulate ideas which don't denigrate other people, ideas which may offend other people but not denigrate them, because to be offensive is not necessarily to denigrate somebody. I find it offensive that we are involved as a nation
in all these wars over the past century, which have been none of our business, I find it offensive that we can't organise a treaty or a series of treaties with this country's Indigenous First Nations people. I find it offensive that we have poverty. I find it offensive that we have homelessness. But the issue is, can I speak about that? If I work for a community housing association, do I have to sign a contract that says I can't actually comment on the job I'm doing, or I can't comment outside that job in a public forum, as public servants can't comment on it publicly? And we are seeing this push by governments at all levels to actually regulate not just our behaviour, but more importantly regulate what we can say in the public domain. It's one thing me being a representative of the state if I'm working for the state, but in my private life I should be able to run a Twitter account, I should be able to run a Facebook page, I should be able to articulate my position on various issues in these mediums without the threat of me losing my job. And this is the dilemma that we face today, that we are finding more and more that we are constrained. And this has allowed the situation to occur where we no longer have the concept of a public intellectual. These are public figures who are able to speak on behalf of the many, who will be able to speak regarding government policy in public forums. If every bureaucrat can't speak in a public forum in a private capacity, if every person working for a corporation can't speak about that particular field of human endeavour, if every person can't articulate their beliefs in society, we then have a situation where censorship gains an extremely difficult, an extreme power, as we see in China, in communist China, where people can't speak about certain issues because they may offend the government. We have laws there. They have laws there where you can be jailed, for subversion. You can be jailed for this. You can be jailed for that, for threatening the state, and the list goes on and on. So we've got to be very careful at the minute, because we are now in a position where we are being asked to sign away our constitutional rights to an implied freedom of speech and our constitutional right to religious expression, religious freedom. Remember, I'm an atheist, right? In 33 countries in the Middle East and in Brunei, it is a capital offence. You can be executed for being an atheist. So we don't want to find ourselves in that situation. So we need to be able to divide ourselves from our work and our personal life, from our work and our life within the community, and we should be able to freely express our ideas outside our workspace without that space being manipulated and controlled by employers and by governments at the local, state and federal level. So next time you're asked to look at a contract which actually inhibits your rights to freedom of speech, what inhibits your rights as a human being in order to get a job, think about it. And if you do sign that contract and you have any disputes, remember that you cannot sign away your constitutional rights and you cannot sign away your legal rights. There's always a way out. Next week, it'll be election week. We'll talk about the election.